Hey everybody, Mr. Regan here, and if you're watching this guide video, we're going to be breaking down the proposal body paragraphs that we're going to be writing as the next part of our overall proposal. So when looking at our overall proposal, we know that our proposal is broken up into 5 parts. We have the introduction, which is the part we just completed. We have 3 body paragraphs, 1, 2, 3, and then we're going to have a conclusion. Today, we're going to be talking about the 3 body paragraphs that you see here and how you're going to be writing them about the criteria that was the focus of our overall internship. And more importantly, the evidence and reasoning we're going to be using for how your design minimized pod cost, how your design minimized cargo damage, and how it minimized shell damage. So let's go ahead and break down the body paragraphs and what we're trying to accomplish here. So we know that our design proposal is a scientific argument, and this scientific argument has a target audience of Nishikar and the IDAC. This is who we're writing to. In our proposal, we have our claim, which is our optimal design. This is the pod design that we are offering up to Nisha and the IDAC that we feel best minimizes all 3 of our criteria. Now, in order for us to argue that this is the best and most optimal design, we're going to need to use evidence. Evidence that's going to come from our research and design cycle. So those first 2 phases of our overall internship. And this evidence is going to come in 4 different forms. So there's 4 types, I should say, of evidence that we're going to be using. The pod criteria results, our internship articles, Nisha's feedback data, and our pod drop results. These are the pieces of evidence that we're going to use to support our claim. And then we're going to use this evidence in our reasoning. The reasoning is where we're going to show how we minimize the criteria, how this evidence is examples of how we brought the cost down, the cargo damage down, and the shell damage down. So let's talk about these 4 types of evidence. So the 4 types of evidence that we're going to be using is going to be direct text and data evidence, meaning it's going to come directly from your test results, the articles you read, the feedback you got, and the data overall from our feedback. It needs to come directly from that. Okay, these, remember, direct text evidence and data evidence is things that we can literally take out and put into our proposal. Okay, so let's talk about the first one. The first bit of data, direct data that you're going to be using is comparing pod criteria results. So for example, pod iterative test number 1 versus pod iterative test number 2. Now, mechanical engineers compare the criteria result of one pod to another pod to show that the criteria was better in one design versus another. Again, showing this idea that it's optimal or best considering the situation. The other type of direct data evidence is when they compare pod drop results. So that's the impact force, the mass, the velocity, and again, comparing pod 1 to pod 2. Okay. Now, mechanical engineers compare the drop results from one pod to another to show that their design is better suited for the collision, or in this case, the job that it's supposed to do in helping out Nisha and the IDAC with their natural disaster victims. Okay, so we're comparing. That's the other type of evidence we get to use, one versus another. Okay, next is the internship articles. So these are the articles we read throughout our internship. Mechanical engineers use scientific texts to show how their design is supported by common science information, common science principles, and laws. This helps to give, again, support and validation to what our design ideas are. And finally, Nisha's feedback, and that also includes the team data that we collected about each and every person's feedback. Mechanical engineers use feedback from other mechanical engineers to show their ideas are supported by other scientists. When other scientists support their ideas, okay, then it again validates their design ideas overall. So these are the 4 types of evidence that we're going to be using in our proposal. We'll be comparing the pod criteria results, so shell damage to shell damage, cost to cost, cargo to cargo. We're going to be comparing the pod drop results, so impact force to impact force, mass to mass, velocity to velocity, okay, data to data kind of thing. Internship articles, so we'll be taking direct text evidence about how our pod design is optimal. And then finally, the feedback, whether it's text evidence for Nisha from Nisha's direct feedback or even comparing data. Okay, these are the 4 types of data we're going to use. So how can we use this evidence to explain how our design is optimal for minimizing criteria? So how do we use these 4 pieces of evidence to prove our design is best? Well, we're going to use all 4 of these bits of evidence, okay? We're using all 4 types to argue your pod is designed for each of our 3 criteria. So for each paragraph, paragraph 1, you're going to be using all 4. Paragraph 2, all 4, and paragraph 3, all 4, okay? Now, when using these, here's what we're focusing on. For example, in your first paragraph, you're going to be arguing how your design is optimal for minimizing pod costs. So you're going to have to ask yourself 4 very important questions about the evidence you're about to use. Number 1, how can I use Nisha's feedback to show my design is optimal for minimizing cost? Okay, so that's the feedback data that she gave you. Number 2, how can I use the force, mass, and velocity data to show my design is optimal for minimizing cost? So how can I compare one pod result to another to show it's optimal? Number 3, how can I compare the criteria data to show my design is optimal for minimizing costs? Again, comparing one pod to the other, showing that I was able to minimize costs or best minimize costs. And lastly, how can I use the text evidence from the article to show my design is optimal for minimizing costs? So as you're writing your body paragraphs, you have to ask yourself those 4 questions to help you pick out the evidence you're going to use. So let's go over some examples of the evidence you could use to show that you minimize pod costs. So we have our 4 bits of evidence. We have Nisha's feedback. We have our iterative tests where we are comparing the criteria to one another. We have the article's direct text evidence, and then we have our drop data comparison. So notice all 4 types of evidence, and we're going to look at how we use these to argue that our pod best minimize costs, because that's our example, okay? For the first one, Nisha's feedback, okay? When looking at her email that she sent you, it said, Nisha said, you've done a great job designing an affordable pod. So right off the bat, that's a mechanical engineer giving you positive feedback about your design idea. So for my reasoning section, I would talk about, hey, this shows that I minimize costs to get my optimal pod design because this other mechanical engineer is giving positive feedback, saying we did a good job, leading us to believe that this could be an optimal design, okay? Again, when other scientists are giving positive feedback about it being good or optimal in some way, that's great evidence to support your design idea. Next, iterative tests, comparing the criteria. So comparing the criteria of one to the other. So if we're looking at this, I have the very first pod on the top row and the second pod on the bottom row. And if I were to look at this in the testing log, right, test pod 1 costs $2,000 versus test pod 2 costs $1,500. So if test pod 2 is my optimal design, if it's my better, if it's my design that I'm arguing in my proposal, okay, I would write this very simply by saying this shows I minimized cost to get my optimal pod design because my design costs $1,500. This other design I had costs $2,000. Clearly mine is better, has a lower cost. Again, comparing those 2 tests allows me as a scientist to say, look, even though there's these other design ideas, this one's better overall compared to these other ones. Again, helping to support this idea. So my direct text evidence for Nisha's, for example, are things she directly said. So notice direct text evidence. Whereas my criteria comparison is direct data evidence. This pod was 2,000. This pod was 1,500. These are pieces of data that no one can argue. They're black and white. They're concrete. They're right there. They're not opinions. They're not ideas. They are data given directly from an email from a mechanical engineer and data from our testing. Let's look at the other 2. Article direct text evidence. So this is evidence directly from the article. Notice I'm taking evidence from a data table. Okay, still direct text evidence, but from a data table. In the material data table, it costs $50 to make the material out of the outer shell of steel. Okay, so there's 2 ways I can go about arguing this. The first one is I can compare steel to another cost. So I could say that this shows I minimize cost to get my optimal pod design because steel costs $50 and maybe, I don't know, carbon fiber costs $60. So I can talk about the cost of the materials I use. I use a cheaper cost. This brought my cost down. I could also use some of the descriptions. It is a strong and relatively inexpensive, okay, but quite heavy. Okay, this shows I minimize costs to get my optimal pod design because this is a material that's relatively inexpensive according to this article. Okay, so there's others that are more expensive. So I could use either one, whether it's direct text evidence, or in this case, that data evidence comparing steel to some other type of material. And finally, we have our drop data comparison. This one's a little tough, okay? This is where we compare the drop data of one pod to the other. And this one might seem a little hard to connect the dots, but let's do it together. So if we're looking at our drop data here, my evidence. In test pod 1, the impact force was 2,200. In test pod 2, the impact force was 1,000. We'll see that. So remember, let's say my optimal design is test pod 2. This is the one I'm arguing in my proposal. So this shows I minimize costs, my optimal design lower, right? Or minimize this is my optimal pod design because I was able to minimize costs and minimize impact force, okay? So when looking at the impact force of 1,000, you could talk about how I use cheaper materials to get that lower, which allows it to survive the impact better. You can talk about how the overall cost of this, okay, help to drive down the overall impact force, okay? But we're comparing the impact force to the cost of the overall pod, helping to show that while I minimize the impact force, I was also able to minimize the cost, okay? So this is where you're going to be writing about each of the different pieces of evidence you used when minimizing pod costs. So for example, if you want to start with paragraph 3, you can, or if you want to start with a different one, you should be able to use these examples to kind of help you write the others. But in the first one, this is where you'll use Nisha's feedback to support how you were able to minimize costs or how you're able to minimize shell damage or cargo damage. The second one's comparing the criteria results, ready? So that's cost to cost or damage to damage. The next one is the article direct text evidence. Okay, so using any of those articles and the evidence to show that you were able to bring the cost down. We have all the articles listed there. And finally, comparing the drop data. So this is where, excuse me, you look to compare impact force, mass to mass, and so on. Okay, so these are the 4 sections with the 4 pieces of evidence you use to write a single body paragraph. You'll do this 3 times for each of the 3 body paragraphs, and that will complete the evidence and reasoning section. So take a second. Do you understand what each of the 3 body paragraphs will be focusing on in the proposal? So the type of evidence you're using or how to write your reasoning, okay? And the 4 pieces of evidence you can use in your reasoning for your optimal design. Do you understand how to use Nisha's feedback? Do we understand how to use the different comparative data? Do we understand how to use the articles? If the answer is yes, put your X in green. If we have any questions, put your X's in yellow or red. Otherwise, good luck.